and welcome to Fun Scale Models. This series we focus on building the Macchi 202 Folgore Park Flyer model. The model features a wingspan of 30 inches and weighs approximately 8 ounces ready to fly. It's powered by a brushless 24-gram outrunner motor, has a 12 to 15 amp speed controller, and is powered by a 2S 250 milliamp battery pack. If you want to build your own Macchi, you can get the plans for free at modelaviation.com. Just search for Macchi 202. On the site, you can also get the templates for the printed tissue, where you can go ahead and make this particular paint scheme for the model. If you want to get the parts ready-made, you can order a short kit through Manzano Laserworks, and I'll link them in the description. The spinner is available through Rabbit Models, and the model features not only the printed tissue, flat sheet canopy, and plug-in landing gear. This series will focus on the overall building techniques. If you want a more in-depth video on how to build a Park Flyer, I recommend watching my series on the Park Flyer P40C Tomahawk, and I'll link it in the video.
Once you've obtained the plans, you'll want to give them a thorough review, looking at both the main sections, top and bottom, as well as the detailed areas. One nice feature about the plans, you can also cut them along the dashed line if you want to have just the wing or the fuselage area. The parts are shown on the part sheet. These are full size and primarily made from 3/32 balsa, and there's some light ply. There's also a section on that for some templates for the model. If you want to get building fast, I highly recommend ordering the short kit from Manzano Laserworks. Here you can see the parts that have been cut for the prototype, excellent quality wood, and nice clean cuts. Whether you hand cut your own parts or you order them from Manzano, you'll need some additional materials to finish out the model. You'll need some 1/4 inch balsa. This is primarily used for the leading edges. Some 3/32 and some 1/16 balsa, medium density. One benefit of ordering the parts from Manzano is you can use the exterior edges to strip out some of the stringers. I like to start my models by working on the tail feathers first. Here you can see where they are located on the plans. Looking at them a little bit closer, you can see that they're primarily made from 3/32 sheet parts as well as 3/32 sheet stringers. One thing that you will need to have is some 1/32 wire. This is bent into a U shape to help connect the elevator halves, and you can have just one horn on one side. Before getting into construction, I did want to discuss a little bit about pins and the ones that I use. Here you can see 4 types shown. The first one is the standard 1-inch T-pin. What's nice about these is they're about a 32nd inch in diameter and work really well for doing spacing, especially like when you're setting up ailerons and building the wing. Next up is a thumbtack. This is great for holding the wax paper and the plans down. And the final 2 are 2 different sized push pins. One is a standard 3/8 of an inch and one's a 5/8 inch pin. The taller pin, the 5/8 one, allows you to pin and hold in place items that are a little bit larger that a 3/8 isn't able to hold in place. Here you can see the wax paper has been set down and the parts have been set in place. One thing I always try and do on my builds is try not to put the pin through the part itself. This can at times weaken the part. Instead, use a push pin to sort of hold them in place to either the side or the top of the bottom. Once all the parts have been set in place like this, go ahead and glue them in place. Now, from the stringers that you've cut from the perimeter of the parts sheet, go ahead and cut some stringers to length and glue them in place. With the horizontal and the vertical parts unpinned from the bore, set them flat back down again and sand them with a large sanding block, 120 to start with, and then finish it with 220. When it came time to sand the exterior edges of the horizontal and the vertical, I wanted to try a little bit different technique to get some uniformity. I glued some scrap pieces of wood together and had a separation of about 1/8 of an inch before I added the scrap sandpaper on top. This sandpaper is 220 grit. And it made it very easy just to drag this around the outside edge of the horizontal, making a nice curved surface. Here you can see the vertical and the rudder have been separated, and I've marked the locations of the hinges. For the hinges, I'm using CA hinges cut from a sheet. They're about 1/4 of an inch wide and about 3/4 of an inch in length. Once that had been marked, I cut them with an X-Acto and then used the sanding tool to sand the rear of the vertical. Fuselage construction is next. If you look at the plans, you can see there are quite a few detailed drawings around the cross sections and how to set up both the motor as well as the servos. Looking further, you can see there's some additional details on how to build air filters and exhaust stacks. One item you will notice that's different on the plans versus what you may see in the photographs is around the hatch. It was identified when building the prototype that the battery needed to be moved further forward to help get the correct center of gravity. Therefore, the hatch was enlarged on the production version. However, the overall construction of the hatch and the fuselage is the same as what you'll see in the photographs. One different feature for some modelers is how the keel and the formers connect together. Typically there's a notch in the former that matches the shape of the keel itself. Instead, on this design, there is a stringer that connects both the top and the bottom keels together, and the halves of the formers are glued to this. Start by laying out all the keels in place over the plans. As mentioned previously, try not to push the pins through the keels, but use them to hold them in place. Use some of the stringers that you've cut to mark and put in position to attach the upper and lower keels together. Here, looking at the overall top view, you can see the completed keel framing. Once you've completed gluing all the keels and the stringers together, give the overall structure a good sanding with 120 and then follow up with 220 grit sandpaper. This helps to make sure that everything is level and you have smooth surfaces to glue the formers to. Before gluing the formers to the fuselage keel, it's best to get all of the subformers attached to the main formers. Here in this picture you can see that there are several smaller formers that are glued to the main one. When ready to start gluing the formers to the keel, I recommend using a 1-2-3 milling block. These are nice in that they have some weight to them, as well as the angles are 90 degrees, so it makes it really easy to go ahead and ensure that the formers are vertical to the board. Looking at this picture, there are several things we'll be reviewing. The first off is the blue line. The blue line indicates where the updated hatch extends to. It goes from F5 all the way back to F7. The area in yellow. These are the horizontal mounting rails. They are made from 1/4 inch wide 3/32 balsa cut to length. The area in green is where the elevator and rudder servos are mounted. There's a couple of different options on how to mount them. Let's take a look at those now. On the lower right, you can see the option of gluing them the back of F7A. The servos used were 4.3 gram servos, but up to 5.5 should be sufficient. The area in green is where they be mounted on either side of the keel. The notation for SR is for the part called servo rail that's mounted in the light ply section. On the prototype, I ended up mounting the servos on either side of the keel. One thing to note was that when I originally designed the model, the servos were not going to go there, and therefore the keel part K5 didn't have the notches. The areas in red are the next area of focus. This shows where the piggyback stringers are added, and the detail on the top area shows an overhead view of what this looks like. To better understand how the piggyback stringer works, let's use another picture. Here you can see a different angle of the fuselage. The scrap piggyback stringer is 3/32 and it gets notched into F2 and butts up against F3 right below the notch. Then the main stringer is laid over the top of all of this, which ends up requiring the piggyback stringer to be glued to the main stringer. Once these two are all glued in place, you trim them off at the former and later sand them down. What's nice about this is it doesn't put a lot of stress and helps reduce warping on a lightly built structure, but doesn't decrease any of the strength of it. Here you can also see that the wing saddle has been added. I do recommend wetting the outside of it. I like to use Windex, and the ammonia helps to soften the wood to allow it to form better to the contours of the formers. Looking at the tail section here, you can see some of the stringers have been added. Note that any of the stringers that are below the horizontal mounting rails end at F10. Those that are above it end at F11. Looking at it a little bit closer here, we see how the stringers under the horizontal rails are added. They sit on top of F10A and end at F11. And there's 3 of them there, you just space them out evenly. Also, starting on the tail cone, we add TCLA first. This has a notch in it to allow for the later installation of the tail wheel. When adding the remaining stringers to the fuselage, it's best to leave the stringers that are between the hatch area out for now. As you can see in this picture, the stringers that have the X marks on them and the red dash lines are the areas where you would leave them off. It's better to add them once you've added the subformers in place for the hatch. Again, the blue line shows where on the production model the hatch goes to. I recommend placing clear or magic tape on the bottom hatch rail. This will help prevent it from being glued to the upper hatch rail. In addition to adding tape to the rails, I also recommend that you add it to the faces of F7B and F5B. In this picture you can see the next progression in the hatch. So the subformers of F5B and F7B have been slid into place. The hatch rail has also been slid into place, and the stringers have been added. When overall you're happy with this, go ahead and glue these parts together. Once that is dried, you can go ahead and remove the magic tape and then blend the top and bottom hatch rails into the side of the fuselage. When shaping the tail cone, I found it's best to use a block plane first to knock down and get into the general shape, and then you can go ahead and finish it off. Here you can see the final shaped tail cone, as well as the plywood tail wheel part. I do recommend not gluing it in at this time. Add it later once the model has been covered and completed. Here you can see the 3D printed spinner has been mounted temporarily to the motor. The motor used on the prototype is a 24-gram 1700 kV motor and uses a radial mount to attach it to the fuselage. Here you can see the radial mount sitting on top of the F3 detail on the plans. Because the model uses a 3-bladed propeller, right thrust is required of about 1.5 to 2 degrees. To achieve this, you have to move the center line of the motor over to be even with the outside edge of the keel. Here you can see I've added some masking tape to the radial mount to show the offset needed, as well as the 1/32 shim that's needed behind it. With the motor mount in place, add F1. This is also a good time to start to rough shape the piggyback stringers if you haven't done so yet. As you start to sand the nose into final shape, use the etched line on F1 as a reference. Here you can see the rough sanding of the shape. Final sanding later will be with 220 or 300 grit sandpaper. And here the motor is mounted with the spinner. Once the motor is mounted, you can go ahead and glue F3 in place. This is primarily there just to provide some additional material for the mounting screws to go into. Depending on your motor, if you're using something different than what was used in the prototype, you may need to move this forward of F3 versus behind it, as you see in the picture. Create yourself some ducting from light cardstock and glue it in place. This goes from the opening on F3A to the bottom of F4. There is some 1/16 balsa cross grain decking that is added. This is where you would be able to mount your battery pack, your receiver, and if you're going to use the cockpit, this gets glued to that area as well. Before cutting the hatch free, make sure you sand the entire fuselage smooth of any bumps, any areas that are rough. This will provide a much better surface for when you're covering it later. Go ahead and cut the hatch free at the keels. As mentioned earlier, this is the prototype's hatch, and the full-size production version goes to F5. The rudder and elevator servos are mounted now. I use easy connectors on the horns before putting them in place. This wraps up the main construction on the fuselage. In our next video, we'll be showing on how to build the wing. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and have a great day.